Okay. You want to go ahead and Tarak?
You want to do that? Introduction to Dr. Jeste. Dr. Jeste has been always a mentor for us, even from the distance. He is a senior associate dean for healthy aging and senior care at Estelle and Edgar Levy Memorial Chair of Aging. He's also a distinguished professor of psychiatry of neuroscience at University of California, San Diego. And he's the co-director of UC San Diego IBM Center for Artificial Intelligence on Healthy Aging. He obtained his education in Pune and psychiatry training in Mumbai and subsequently again in Cornell University. And he did neurology residency later on in George Washington University. So he's double boarded there. He did his research fellowship later on in other geriatric psychiatry areas. He's a pioneer in geriatric psychiatry field, starting the Geriatric Psychiatry Association, where I met him first time in 1993 or somewhere, I remember. He has published several books, 13 plus books, so many articles, and invitation lectures at honorary societies. I remember him proudly at the convocation of American Psychiatric Association. He's the first Indian psychiatrist to be the president of American Psychiatric Association. And he's also president of several other organizations, including American Association for Geriatric Psychiatry and West Coast College of Biological Psychiatry, etc. He has been editor-in-chief for many of the journals and has many, many awards all over the world for different things. But most of it, we know Dr. Jeste for his recent works in last 10, 15 years on positive psychiatry and positive aspect of aging. And that's what we will hear today. And then we have another speaker, Dr. Gandhi. Dr. Gandhi is the upcoming psychiatrist. I met her first time at some of the APA meetings. She's originally from India, and she did her psychiatry residency in Albert Einstein Medical Center in Philadelphia. Then she did a fellowship in forensic psychiatry, and then later on did a child psychiatry, both at Yale University. Later on, she's currently working as a clinical instructor with Brown University, and she's also working in the field of child psychiatry at Bradley Hospital in Rhode Island. She is an integral part of our Indo-American Psychiatric Association. She's an extended EC, and she has also served in APA in various roles, and including the BOT as a resident rep. Thank you, both of you, for joining us.
Okay. All right, Dr. Jeste, the floor is yours, and we are all waiting to hear the wise words of wisdom from you, Dr. Jeste. You can share your screen and get started.
Sure.
If you go to this, okay, good.
Okay, so thank you so much, Tarek, for such a kind introduction. Thank you, Ravi, for inviting me. And so I have been a proud member of API for many, many years, and I've been honored to talk at API meetings, both in the US and in India on several occasions. And so it's always a pleasure to come back to API and speak with all of you. So I'm going to talk today on wisdom and happiness in the era of modern pandemics. So in terms of disclosure, most of my work is supported by NIH and UCSD, no financial relationship with the pharmaceutical industry. So when we talk about pandemic today, we obviously think about COVID-19. COVID-19 has been around now since this January. It has killed about 120,000 Americans so far, and it's continuing. However, there is another pandemic that has been going on for last 20 plus years, and that is killing even more people per year in the States. So this is the suicide rate in the US from 1999 to 2017. In 1999, the number of suicides compared to what number we have today, there's a 30% change. So, and these are suicides that have gone up both in men, there's the upper line, and the women, the lower line. Men always have had a higher risk of successful suicide than women. And this is suicide at all ages. The increase in mortality from opioid abuse has been even more striking. In 1999, 8,000 Americans died from opioid-related death. Today, that number is 50,000. Six-fold increase in opioid deaths in the last 20 years. One factor that is common to both suicides and opioid use is loneliness. Loneliness and social isolation are considered a grand challenge for the society. Loneliness and social isolation are related, but they are not the same. Loneliness is subjective. You feel alone, you feel distressed by being alone. That is loneliness. Social isolation refers to lack of social relationships. So, for example, if I have 2 friends and somebody else has 5 friends, I'm socially more isolated than that person. However, it's quite possible that the other person with 5 friends is more lonely than I am with 2 friends only, because it is subjective. So you can be lonely in a crowd and not lonely in a cave. So why are we thinking about loneliness seriously? Because it is called a silent killer. Loneliness increases the odds of mortality by 30%. It is as dangerous to health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, and more dangerous than mild to moderate level of obesity. And look at this number. According to the US Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, 162,000 Americans die every year from loneliness. That is more than the number of deaths secondary to lung cancer or stroke. And these deaths from loneliness, they include deaths from suicides, opioid abuse, as well as other factors that are related to loneliness. And loneliness is not strictly a health issue. It is also a financial or economic issue. And it is global. In the UK, a new minister of loneliness was appointed 2 years ago. The reason for this appointment was that the government and the businesses found that they were losing billions of pounds every year because of loneliness of the workers, which reduced the productivity. So loneliness has been a major problem globally that is shortening the lifespan and costing billions of dollars and pounds every year. So that is a pandemic that has been going on for 20 years. And now, of course, added to that, the COVID, as well as
and thank you for all your help and support over the years. And have a happy and wonderful 35th anniversary. And I still
hearing some disturbance. Can you?
Yeah, we're also hearing it.
Oh, okay, sir.
Okay, now it's clear.
Okay, good. Thank you. So this pandemic, as I said, is causing major problems, and we need to think about how we are going to control that. The average lifespan has dropped in the US for the first time since the 1950s. It kept on growing, but beginning around 2016, 17, 18, it dropped 2 years in a row. This never happened before. And the cause is primarily the suicides, opioid abuse, and loneliness-related deaths. The good news, and that's the next part of my talk, is that there is a possible solution. And the solution is wisdom. Several of our studies have shown that there's a strong inverse relationship between loneliness and wisdom. This is a study using Amazon's M-Turk or mechanical Turk. So we included 2,400 Americans across a lifespan, and we administered them several different scales, including a scale for loneliness and a scale for wisdom. And we found that the correlation between the two was negative 0.51. In behavioral research, a correlation of 0.5 is pretty significant. And we have replicated that finding in 3 other studies, including one we are doing in collaboration with people in Italy. So what we are finding is that people who score high on wisdom are not lonely, and vice versa. So, of course, before talking more, we need to think about what is wisdom, right? So what is wisdom? Wisdom is a personality trait. It's a personality trait like resilience, optimism. However, it is complex. It has several different components. And I will talk about those components in a couple of slides later. People often confuse wisdom and intelligence. Wisdom is much more than intelligence. Intelligence is necessary but not sufficient. We all know people who have high IQ and yet who are very unwise. These are not, they may be smartest people, but they are not the happiest people. They are not the people who are contributing in a major way to the society. Sometimes they are actually hurting other people. Wisdom is associated with greater well-being, happiness, life satisfaction, and better general health. And that doesn't apply necessarily to intelligence. All of us who grew up in India, we always learned about wisdom from the Gita. We all considered Gita as the distillation of wisdom. That's what Lord Krishna did when he told Arjuna. He was not just telling him about how to fight the war with the Kauravas. He was actually giving him philosophy of life that would apply to any single person anywhere in the world. So we were interested in finding out how wisdom was defined by the Gita. So we did a study that is a qualitative, quantitative mixed method study. We looked at English translations of Gita, including an online version. And we had a medical anthropologist as a consultant. So what we wanted to find out was the context in which the word wisdom, or its opposite, which is foolishness, was used. For example, the Gita says that a wise man doesn't sit on the fence all the time, but actually is decisive when it is needed. And that's the problem that Arjuna was facing. He didn't know whether to fight with the Kauravas or not fight. And Lord Krishna said, a wise person doesn't do that. He comes to a decision. So that told us that decisiveness is a component of wisdom. So similarly, we looked at various other components. We published a paper in the journal called Psychiatry with my colleague Ipsit Vahia, in which we compared the conceptualization of wisdom in the Gita with the modern conceptualization of wisdom. Modern empirical research on wisdom started in the 1970s in the Max Planck Institute in Berlin and at University of Southern California. And we have been studying that for the last 15 years. And we have published a bunch of papers in this area. So what are the different components of wisdom? One is self-reflection. It is ability to look inside, try to understand ourselves, why we do something, why we don't do such thing. Second is compassion or kindness. kindness toward others, but also kindness toward ourselves, self-compassion as well as compassion to others. Then comes emotional regulation. Think about a teenager. His emotions fluctuate from hour to hour and minute to minute, right? And then think about a wise older person who is calm, controlled. So that's the emotional regulation. Then comes decisiveness amid uncertainty. A wise person accepts the fact that there is no clear known truth. There are uncertainties, there are diverse perspectives. And yet one has to be decisive when you need to be. So it is decisiveness amid uncertainty. And last but not least is spirituality. Spirituality is different from religiosity. So you can be an atheist and still be spiritual. Spirituality means belief in something larger than humanity, larger than what we see, hear, or know. How do you measure wisdom? So there have been several scales, just like other personality traits. There are self-reports based scales. We developed a scale called San Diego Wisdom Scale, or SDWISE. This has been translated into several languages and is being used in a bunch of different studies. So this scale has 24 items. So these are 24 statements. And each statement, you have to give a rating of 1 to 5. For example, one item is, it is important that I understand the reasons for my actions. So here we are testing self-reflection, your ability to look inward. And so you can say you strongly disagree with this or strongly agree or something in between. Another question is, I have trouble thinking clearly when I'm upset. So this is opposite of emotional regulation. When you are upset and you can't regulate your emotions, you can't think clearly. Wisdom, like other personality traits, is based in the brain. About half of these traits, in the sense about 50% of each trait, is genetically determined, whereas 50%, the remaining 50% is environmentally and behaviorally determined. But still, they're primarily localized in specific parts of the brain. So we published a review of neurocircuitry of wisdom in what is now the JAMA Psychiatry. And we found that the main parts of the brain that were involved were prefrontal cortex and amygdala. And the prefrontal cortex includes dorsolateral, ventromedial, and anterior cingulate, and the amygdala is part of the limbic striatum. So what is interesting is that the prefrontal cortex is the newest part of the brain in evolution, whereas amygdala is the oldest part of the brain in evolution. So wisdom reflects a balance between the oldest and the newest parts of the brain. Now we all know, we talk about older people being wiser people. Is that really true? Actually, we don't know the answer yet because there are no longitudinal studies using the same scale. We are actually about to complete a study. This will be the first study of its kind. We have followed people for 8 years using scale for wisdom. And we have data on several hundred people. We are in the process of analyzing the data, so I don't want to give out the results till the paper submitted and in press. But there are a number of cross-sectional studies that show that older people are better than the younger ones on several components of wisdom. For example, older people have better control of their emotions. They tend to be more positive emotions and memory. They are more decisive because their decisions are based on their experience. Younger people don't have that experience. They are more empathic. They're more compassionate, more pro-social. And they have better self-reflection. And actually, if we think about ourselves, no matter how old we are, usually with age, I think we become more emotionally regulated, more compassionate, more self-reflective. So I do think that some components of wisdom do increase with aging. But one of the most interesting parts of research, and not too many people know about this, is something called grandmother hypothesis of wisdom. What is grandmother hypothesis? Studies in bottlenose dolphins, killer whales, Seychelles warblers, this is a species of bird, and humans show that when grandma GM helps her adult daughter D in raising her children, this adult daughter D she lives longer, she is happier, and she produces more children than her mother did. And there is greater happiness, health, and longevity in all three generations. And you might think this is feel-good TV science. These are papers published in Nature, Science, Evolutionary Anthropology, some of the absolute top journals in the world in any science. So what does it mean? So what it means to me is this, that Darwin's hypothesis of survival of the fittest meant that animals live only so long as they can reproduce and contribute to the survival of the species. We usually have, women have menopause around age 45, men have andropause around same age 45. So if you live to 90, half of our lifetime, we are infertile, we are not contributing to species survival. So why do we live beyond that, right? It is, so my theory is that we live because we are contributing to the species survival indirectly by helping the younger generation live longer, be happier, and be more fertile. And some of my colleagues recently published a paper in Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences on grandparent genes. And they showed that mutations of certain genes like ApoE and CD33 are associated with better functioning hearts and brains as well as longevity. That means if you have those variants of genes, you would live longer, and you can then help the younger generation more because of healthier hearts and brains. Which brings us to intergenerational activities. Intergenerational activities are very important for both the generations. There was a study called Experience Core. This was funded by MacArthur Foundation, done at Hopkins. What they did was, this was a randomized control trial. They took some older people who had retired from their job, and they had to agree to spend at least 15 hours a week in public elementary school as mentors and tutors to enhance the children's literacy development and behavior management skills. After 1 year, the children's grades went through the roof and they were very happy, not surprising. Older people, their mental and physical health improved. And even more striking, biomarkers of stress and aging in blood and urine improved. And the volume of the hippocampus on brain MRI, so brain MRI was done before and after. The volume of hippocampus on the brain MRI in the adults who participated in this work was larger than that of people who did not participate. And as many of you know, volume of the hippocampus is related to development of Alzheimer's disease. So clearly, intergenerational activity is useful for the younger ones, but also for older ones. And so that is where then the wisdom comes in. So I talked about wisdom being helpful potentially, but really, can we increase wisdom? Actually, the answer is yes, resoundingly yes. We just published a paper in JAMA Psychiatry 2 months ago. This was a meta-analysis of 57 randomized controlled trials to enhance component of wisdom. There are 3 components that people had studied: empathy or compassion, emotional regulation, and spirituality. And these were studies done in people with mental illnesses, physical illnesses, as well as people from the general community. Most of these were psychosocial behavioral intervention. And obviously, like all studies, they have their limitations, but nearly half of these studies reported significant increase in the level of the specific component of wisdom with moderate to large effect size. So what this means is that at least in some people, with the right intervention, you can increase the level of empathy, compassion, or emotional regulation or spirituality. But this is about individual components. What about wisdom as a whole? We published a study very recently, just a month ago it came out. This is a study of 89 older people who lived in retirement communities, 5 retirement communities in 3 states, California, Illinois, and Arizona. And this is a randomized control trial using a psychosocial behavioral intervention. And it was administered by unlicensed staff in those facilities. We trained them, but the staff actually used the intervention. And the intervention included things like savoring positive emotion, engagement in value-based activities, like helping others, keeping a gratitude diary in which you write a couple of things that made you feel grateful to somebody who was helpful, And finally, homework. These are the things you do every day, value-based activities, savoring, and so on. We found there are significant improvement in resilience, wisdom, and perceived stress went down. And a small pilot sub-study here showed that reduction in loneliness mediated increase in compassion. So again, these are small sample sizes. We can't make broad conclusions, but at least it suggests the possibility that we can reduce loneliness by increasing compassion. So we are in the midst of two pandemics, right? One is COVID-19. And right now we are spending billions and billions of dollars and pounds all over the world for discovering either antivirus agents or vaccines, right? And I hope we develop a vaccine soon, and then they'll control COVID-19 just as we have controlled smallpox and cholera and plague and everything. But what about the other pandemic? The pandemic that has been going on for 2 decades and that is killing 162,000 people a year. What is the vaccine for that? We suggest that that vaccine may be wisdom, and both at individual level and at the societal level. And I showed you that actually you can increase wisdom. So in individuals, you can do something, but what about society? Today's society is highly stressed, much more stressed than it was 20 years ago. Studies have shown that. We are much more lonely. There is much more social anomie. There is far more social disconnectedness. There is much greater polarization. And so we need to change that. And the way to change that would be our education system needs to change. Right now, what we do, we just focus on the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. In medical school, we just focus on how to be the best diagnostician, how to learn the newest gadget that is available and how you can interpret that, right? Of course, that is important. That's our job as physicians. But should we not also teach ourselves and our patients compassion, emotional regulation, self-reflection, acceptance of diversity, spirituality? Those are the things that are going to help us be happy and thrive and live longer. And this is something we got to do, because if not, this curve of longevity going down will only continue. You know, we compare different countries through their GDP, gross domestic product, how much money they have. These days, people also have this happiness index. I suggest that instead of that, we should compare the countries by their wisdom index. How compassionate, emotional regulated, self-reflecting, accepting of diverse perspectives, and so on they are. I think that will define wise society, and that's what we should be trying to do. So this is my last slide, that the 3 pills that we need don't cost anything, but they will have far greater significance on our longevity and happiness than any of the pills we take. And these are healthy lifestyle, social support, and wisdom. Let me stop here, and thank you for your attention.
We'll go ahead with a few questions here because we don't know how the time factor will play at the end. So one of the questions is from Dr. Brahma Sharma, a good friend of mine from Pittsburgh. His question was, any correlation between wisdom with EQ, the emotional quotient, or spiritual quotient? And that might be more secular and acceptable than Gita and any religious connotation of wisdom.
Sure.
Your
That's
comment.
a good point. So we haven't looked at emotional quotient because that's still somewhat a vague and diffuse concept, and there is no sort of agreed upon way to measure emotional quotient. Spirituality, though, we have been studying, and we find that the individual components of wisdom, including compassion, emotional regulation, self-reflection, spirituality also correlates inversely with loneliness. So
I have a comment. Last year I was traveling a lot, and during my visits to the various chapters, and I was advised by a good friend that I should read Gita, one sloka a day, and I downloaded an app, and that props up a sloka in the morning every day, and I'm really benefiting from that app. So I'm getting some wise wisdom from the apps now. Anyway, and also Dr. Vasavada mentioned about the the grandparents are protecting the children, grandchildren from adverse experiences. Also, my feeling is sometimes there's no manual for raising children, right? So we are probably not ready to have those children, but we have a ready-made manual in the grandparent, and they take over and do the, like a surrogate mothering, and that is a really blessing, especially in our culture with extended families and all that. Your comment, please.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, think about it this way. We can have a child soon after puberty, right? So somebody can have a child at age 18, boy or girl. How our brain hasn't grown fully by 18. The brain continues to grow at least till 25. There is synaptic pruning and those kinds of things that take place, right?
Right.
So we can produce children before our brain has developed fully. That makes no sense, right? And that's where the grandparents are needed, even from the perspective of evolution.
Right.
So we are so immature to raise children, right? And studies have shown, by the way, when we talk about grandparenting, it is not just for your biological grandchildren. Older people helping younger kids. Studies in Chicago and some other cities have shown that in the underserved areas, when older mentors are involved in helping the young kids, including those in elementary and secondary schools, the rate of behavior problems and legal problems dropped significantly 15 years later.
Right.
So it
Thank
clearly
you.
shows that this kind of grandparenting is essential for reducing the risk of behavior problems and so many other things that happen for kids otherwise.
I do have a practice in the inner city, and especially in minority communities where a lot of parenting is missing. The grandparents really do a wonderful job protecting them and raising them and giving the role modeling and all that. Thank you. So shall we go to the next talk? Tarak, you want to?
No, I just want to comment that, I just want to ask Dilip, Dr. Jeste a question. Is wisdom kind of, it's kind of a luxury? Because if you are like Maslow's, if you are really caught in your basic needs day to day as a child, but maybe you get wisdom from every experience you get. I think we have to learn to soak the wisdom from every experience, even a small encounter with a janitor. It may be a car accident, but I think we should learn to experience, to soak that wisdom that we can apply it later on in our life. Any comments?
You're absolutely correct. I think, so one thing I want to say to start with is that wisdom is not something that restricted to only a small number of people. So wise people are not geniuses necessarily on IQ. Everybody has wisdom, but the degree varies, right? And the degree increases with experience in some people, but not in everybody. We know of some old people who are very unwise, and we also know of young people who are wise. So your point is well taken. In the sense, it's a question of how do we use the experience. So it is like this: when there is a major disaster, some people develop PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Some people have post-traumatic growth. They actually grow from that, and they become stronger psychologically. So likewise, it depends on how you use the experience. And people who are active physically, cognitively, socially, they are more likely to benefit from the experience, whether it is positive or negative. But exactly, you can learn from every single experience and try to make yourself wiser.
We have two more questions. Let me connect with them. Do hard and difficult circumstances improve wisdom when combined with self-reflection?
I think so. The answer is that the experience itself won't produce wisdom. It is you that produces wisdom, right? So it is a question of how we use experience. So when there is a bad, some hard times, it's normal to be depressed or angry or so on. That's absolutely normal. But then what do you do after that? Then after you control it, then think about how I can make use of that. What did I learn from it? How do I face it better next time? Or how I can even prevent that from happening. So that kind of a thing becomes very useful.
Yeah, you touched upon that in the post-traumatic stress versus post-traumatic growth. Right. Hard knocks do make you a better person if you reflect on it and learn from it. And another question was, how do you encourage physicians to improve their EQ?
So,
Can I add to that question too, Dr. Jeste? A lot of time I see that some of these physicians, they are very good in their areas. As my personal friends, they're excellent people. But there may be some kind of group mentality or something that I see that happening in our meetings, etc., that people suddenly lose the temper. It's like, where did this come from? This person is so stable everywhere. It's just in this certain kind of get-togethers, like especially in Indian get-togethers or so, this person are acting a little bit different than they are in their practice or somewhere. So what happens there? Where this lacuna comes from too? So along with EQ, I think that goes in.
That's a great point. Probably you all know this, but both medical students and physicians are at a high risk of suicides as well as substance abuse. Substance abuse because we have access to substances, but suicides, the rate of suicides is increasing has increased over the last 20 years, is including medical students and physicians. And I think what is happening is that the medical school has become increasingly more stressful, and physicians' job has become increasingly more stressful with this managed care, where we are sort of slaves of the system rather than having some control over what we do. And that creates more burnout. And the more burnout then creates anger, depression, and then we take it out on somebody else. So what we need is really increase self-reflection, increase emotional regulation, increase compassion, including self-compassion. Actually, one thing I want to stress here for physicians, that many physicians are very compassionate with their patients and colleagues, but they're very hard on themselves. They're very self-punitive. Why didn't I do the best? How could I make a single mistake? And so I think it is important that we also become self-compassionate. And so those are the things we need to keep ourselves relaxed, enjoy what we do. I think then we'll do not only a better job, but we'll be happier, live longer, and wiser.
We have a lot of questions coming through, but let's continue the presentation. And if we have time, we'll continue to answer the questions in between. So we don't want to lose the presentation. So please stay put, Dr. Jesse. We want to hear more words of wisdom from you. And Dr. Vasavada, I think you are the next one to present.
You know what? Let me skip it. Let Tanuja go, and then
okay, let's go ahead.
Sure,
yeah,
sure.
Dr. Gandhi, it's your turn now. And you can share your screen, unmute yourself. Please go ahead.
Thank you. It's a distinct honor to be a part of this panel, especially hearing Dr. Jeste talk. It's, as I've said earlier, it's a dream come true to be on the same panel as him and Dr. Vasavada and all of you here. I hope that this presentation gives you practical pointers on how to communicate with children during the pandemic. It's clearly not going to be an easy feat. I'm not even close by far to follow the presentation by Dr. Jeste because I'm wondering how much wisdom I've gained over the years. And I'm not sure how much it's going to be in future. But this is going to be simple, practical to kind of lean you into what we need during the pandemic and bring you back to talking about more wisdom after I'm done. So with that, I'll begin with my slides. Are my slides clearly visible?
Yeah.
Okay. So today I'm going to give a brief talk about communicating with and caring for children during the pandemic. As Dr. Jeste very wonderfully described, this pandemic has affected all of us across the globe in ways that have been unimaginable and clearly unprecedented. And the effects of the pandemic, spanned across countries, generations, and ages and gender. What we often don't realize is how much children get affected when you have something of this proportion going on around them. And as adults, I'm hoping I can share some information that we can use to talk to children about the pandemic. In reviewing literature around the impact of children on and their mental health during situations such as the pandemic, which is of a global proportion, often the mental health of children and adolescents can be disproportionately affected and easily overlooked in the context of large-scale emergencies. When it's difficult for adults to deal with the quarantine and social isolation, it's often difficult for children too. And early evidence also shows that in previous pandemics, and this one, that mental health difficulties and behavioral problems increase with the onset of a pandemic in children. There's also a study that's coming out from Italy, which explores the effect of risk factors associated with the pandemic experience on parents and children's well-being. And we know that when parents get stressed due to all the quarantining and other difficulties placed on their daily routine and responsibilities, children also increasingly develop psychological symptoms. In thinking about the way children are affected, we think about, from a psychiatric standpoint, the biological, psychological, and social factors. And in this situation, the environmental factors too that affect a child's emotional understanding and psychological adjustment to the situation. Biologically, you think about pre-existing conditions, medical illness, or personal or family history of mental health problems. Psychologically, there's, depending on the age of the child, fear of infection, fear of falling ill, fear of death for themselves, their family, loved ones, frustration, and also the lack of normal physical activity and interactions with their own peer group. Socially, you have prolonged physical and social isolation, lack of interpersonal contact or interpersonal interaction with family, friends, grandparents. We've also seen the stress of online learning, family stresses, which include financial, social stresses, lack of family supports, and also exposure to scary online content through news and social media about the situation going on in the world. Environmentally, I think we often forget the impact of the pandemic in the global perspective, where many countries and many families have lack of hygienic living conditions for all people. There is even lack of an access to potable water, food, and basic necessities for daily living. And of course, poverty and lack of education play a big role in managing these situations. So when you think about like large-scale emergencies, it's easy to think about the adults, but when you think of children, common misconceptions are that children are too young to understand what's going on, they need to be protected, or children don't have mental health problems, they don't become depressed or anxious, they don't remember what happened, or a child doesn't know what a family is going through, what their parents are going through. There are different ideas about child mental health among families. Again, this varies based on cultural and religious context. Going back to getting, a perspective from literature, children who are in isolation or quarantine during pandemic diseases are often more likely to develop an acute stress disorder, adjustment disorder, develop symptoms of grief, and even score very highly on scales for post-traumatic stress. Separation from parents and loss also have long-term impacts on children's mental health. All of us are aware about the incredible literature on attachment and the importance of attachment to parental and family figures in the early years of a child's life. So this kind of separation can have effects on attachment, disrupt the attachment process, and also affect long-term mental health outcomes. So when we talk about the impact of a pandemic or a large-scale emergency on the mental health of a child, we often forget the aspect of talking to children about what is going on in the world and preparing them for the situation. Literature indicates that when adults talk to children about an illness, they often tend to use technical or factual language, try to minimize the situation, hoping that this is going to minimize the child's distress. Often adults also tend to hide their emotions and speak in a tone or with language that does not have too much emotion, which often leads children to being anxious, wondering about the emotional state of the adults, and being left to fill in the gaps by themselves. in your experience, I'm sure all of you have come across children in your family or children in your practice or with patients asking about questions such as, what is the coronavirus? What's going on in the world? Why can't I see my mom or dad or grandparents if the grandparents are in a nursing home? Why can't they hug or kiss their family members? Why do you have to wear a mask? Why can't children go out and play or eat outside, go to a restaurant? Is school going to be closed forever? Is daycare going to be closed forever? When will they be able to go play outside? What happens if they fall sick? Will they die? And what happens if a family member falls sick, and what it means for the child and their long-term life? The general principles when children have these questions and in talking to children, be it as a provider or as a parent or family member, is to remember that children of all ages have an emotional reaction to separation and stress of parents that's going on around them. Even children as young as 2 years are aware of family stresses and changes around them in the family. When it comes to specific understanding about illness and death, this evolves over time with age, and as the child grows to about 8 to 12 years of age, closer to 12 years of age, there is a more mature and complete understanding of illness and a more adult-like concept of death. Often when children have incomplete or misinformation about the situation, well-meaning adults can give them information that they think the child would want to know, but leave out what's important for the child to understand, often creating more worries for the child as they tend to fill in the gaps in information themselves. It's also important to remember that even if a child is too young to ask questions, they still might have curiosity about the situation and a lot of questions thus around the situation. Most importantly, children watch, learn, and observe their parents and caregivers, so it's important to remember that your stress is clearly evident to the child. So in general, when we are talking about any kind of emergency or here the pandemic with a child, the principles to think about is first assess what the child already knows and understands about the COVID-19 situation. When you start talking to a child, be calm and check in with yourself to see what your emotional state is. If you've dealt with your grief or your emotional state enough and are ready to have that conversation. And if you are, provide simple information based on facts, keeping in mind the child's age and stage of development. Use simple child-friendly language. Try to assure the child that they're safe and protected. Create a safe space in your home and environment, which is open for questions and discussion. Pay attention to what your child is seeing or hearing from the news or social media. And most importantly, teach and practice what you're talking about every day through actions together, and have a plan for safety measures in the home and for an emergency situation, especially if you're talking to older children, because they might be an active participant in making that plan. So while we are talking about the different stages of development and how do you talk to children of different ages about the coronavirus and illness and death, I would be using a lot of content which is educational from the site called tinydocs.com. In my review, I've realized that there are a lot of comics and educational guides which are children-friendly and humorous in explaining very serious concepts to children. So if a child is asking what is COVID-19, you can use something like, I'm sure you've heard about the virus lately. Everybody's talking about it. This might be going on in the news, on the internet. I'm sure you've heard it in your school cafeteria. It could also be present in the community. Children can ask questions like, what is the virus and what do you know about it? You can explain that, this is a disease. There's a disease called COVID-19 going on. It's like the simple flu, and doctors and nurses don't have a cure for it, but there are a lot of scientists who are working on it right now. The most important question for a child is, will it last forever? Will it happen to me? Am I going to die? When they ask, will it last forever? You can use, again, very simple language to say, doctors and scientists are working around the world in finding a cure. They're working on a vaccine, but in the meantime, we all have to work together. In the changes that are coming about in our daily life, there is a huge shift in the daily life and routine for children. So the things you could explain to them are about hand washing. Everybody's heard extensively about, the 5 steps to hand washing, explained by the CDC, the WHO. For children, there is no harm in repetition. And in fact, a lot of repetition might be required for them to remember and keep practicing what you're teaching them. So lead by example, explain the hygiene routine you will be following at home when you go to the market, when you go to school, or even to a relative's house. Explain why you will be wearing a mask if you choose to wear one when you go outside. Discuss concerns about health of family members and why you choose to cocoon for some time, as in quarantine, or place yourself in self-isolation, which might be the case in many states right now where there has been a surge in the coronavirus cases. What helps a lot in these situations is to come up with activities together, because being stuck at home for prolonged durations of time with your children is stressful for both the child and the parent. So having fun activities together can take some of that burden away. Find creative ways to celebrate missed occasions such as birthdays, graduations, or special occasions. As you would have noticed, many families have celebrated graduation this year on social media or in other creative ways. And as I've mentioned before, using comic videos or books to discuss health information also helps in breaking the information down to age-appropriate content. This is another example of explaining what is social distancing to a child. And another graphic presentation to say, social distancing means that you try and avoid crowded places, keep a distance of 6 feet, which is like 2 arms distance from people when you're walking around. This might look like a cartoon, which is endearing and funny, but I work on a children's inpatient unit, and I can't tell you how impactful this is in explaining to children who don't know what 6 feet is and why it's important to maintain that distance, that currently on the inpatient unit, children who've been asking for hugs have now shifted to asking for air high fives and elbow hugs because they know how to maintain a 6 feet social distance. Often, another question that comes up with children is also why can't they visit their grandparents, go to their home, or even if the grandparent is in a nursing home. So it helps to keep the information fact-based and say it's important to keep a distance from elderly family members to protect their health because they are at risk of getting the infection. Other questions children might ask include, will I fall sick? Will I die? It helps to explain the symptoms of the coronavirus in simple words, saying that the most common symptoms are cough, difficulty breathing, fever, and help the child understand that the parent is present to protect them should this happen, and have a plan for what you will do as a family. So while these are general conversations that are going on in families everywhere, there are other things that are very important to discuss, which are how distance learning or online learning is going to happen in a home, changes in co-parenting if there are 2 parents involved who don't live in the same home, might be separated, divorced, or not in a position to parent while living in the same home, and also talking about grief with a child. Distance learning has been very difficult for a lot of children, especially ones who have ADHD, other socio-emotional difficulties, learning disabilities, because there is a lack of supports that were available in school for the child now when they're stuck at home with just the online platform, some online resources, and with their parent to help and guide them through the education. Online learning has been stressful for both children and parents. Parents have been placed in this unique and stressful position of being multitaskers by being the care provider, by working from home or going to work, by being someone who's taking care of younger children if daycares are closed, and also being the teacher for older kids by instituting online curriculum at home. The most important impact of the absence of school education as it was before has been a lack of physical and recreational activities like you would do in school, absence of social interactions with a peer group like friends and teachers, and absence of a support system for many children who need school counsel, access to school counselors, psychologists, teachers, or social workers, and have not the best social environment or generally safe environment at home. So the support system created by the school or the educational system is lacking for a lot of children, which makes online learning a lot more stressful. So the ways in which parents or caregivers could make online learning a little easier is stick to a routine that builds in time, not just for education for the child, but also time for play, fun activities, social media, and also the parents' work time. I've heard a lot of questions from families who've made their distress very clear that it's hard to do online education when they have to work remotely from home. So the best way would be to incorporate their own work time with the child's schedule and make a common schedule for how the family is going to function during the day, trying to simulate as closely as possible a routine which was present prior to the pandemic. What also helps is knowing that traditional timelines and routines will not work during this time. So having realistic expectations of yourself and the family's needs of the child, being creative in instituting different ways of learning, and also practicing compassion, as Dr. Jeste mentioned earlier, self-compassion and compassion for your family, because this is a situation no one's been prepared for. So everybody's learning on the go. So you only get better as you do it, and there is going to be no perfect day. The other situation that a lot of families have been in is challenges with co-parenting. Oftentimes when there is a stressful situation between parents, which could be in the form of separation, divorce, or co-parenting, which is generally not working in the best circumstances, it helps to keep perspective that this might be a time to come together and think of a common working schedule for both parents, to keep differences aside and think about flexibility, and also discuss about areas of conflict or distress, such as parents might have very differential views on safety measures that should be followed at home, social distancing protocols of what they can and cannot do with children when they go outside. So it's important to bring this on the table and have a discussion about it and come up with a plan which is agreeable to the child and the parents, and be flexible in helping the other parent who's missing out on real time with the child to make up for the lost time, maybe during or even after the pandemic, and not hold it against them. The most important situation that I've encountered is when parents disagree on what is good social distancing or what would be good safety measures during the quarantine, or just in general. When one parent thinks that you have to wear a mask everywhere, sanitize very often, wash for 20 seconds, and the other parent feels pretty relaxed about the whole situation. And when the child is visiting the other parent, there is often anxiety about the child contracting the virus or bringing home an infection. So it's important to have this discussion about what is and is not acceptable as a family unit, knowing that co-parenting during the pandemic will need a lot of flexibility, compassion towards each other, and perspective taking that involves that this is temporary. What has been, again, an evolving situation is a lot of families have lost a loved one to COVID-19, and these losses have been very close, distressing, and painful for both adults and children. It's important to remember that, we've talked about or you might have heard about the Kubler-Ross stage of grieving, and adult understanding of death, but the understanding of illness and death is very different in children. Children also grieve, but grief looks very different in children, and the presentation can differ based on the age and stage of development of the child. So again, when you're talking about illness in a family member, yourself, or the death of a loved one in the family to a child, it's important to first assess what the child already knows and understands about the situation. Then it is important to be prepared to have an honest conversation using facts and simple age-appropriate language, keeping in mind the stage of development of the child. It's important to avoid euphemisms, again, depending on the stage of development of the child, saying, grandpa or grandma have gone to sleep, they've been lost, or they've gone away, they've passed away, because children can often interpret it as a temporary state, saying, oh, they've gone to sleep, so they're going to wake up tomorrow. Or, oh, they've been lost, so we can find them again. Just like adults, children handle the news differently, and each child may have a very different reaction to the news depending on how you present it and depending on how they understand it. at any point of time when you're having discussions about serious illness, chronic illness, illness due to the coronavirus, or death of a loved one with a child, and you see changes in behavior which are significant, such as changes in sleep and appetite, appearing worried, withdrawn, depressed, anxious, anything that is a significant change in the child's routine that you as a parent or caregiver palpate to be worrisome, it's important to seek the help of a therapist or psychiatrist to help the child along in the process of grieving. So in speaking of grief, as I've mentioned earlier, grief presents differently in children, and the understanding of death, again, evolves with age and stage of development. We know about the Kubler-Ross stage of grieving, where, in stage 1, when someone hears the news, there's shock, there's denial, and there's isolation. The next stage is anger about the situation, saying, why did this happen? Or why did it happen to me? Why did I have to lose my loved one? Then comes bargaining, where there is often some understanding of the reality of the situation, but bargaining to see if it could be different. The next step is usually depression, where you have some understanding saying, yes, there's been a loss, it's permanent, finally leading into acceptance, and into a stage of grieving where you realize that the loss is real and permanent. In children, as I mentioned, grief is different based on age, but babies and toddlers also experience grief. It won't be your typical presentation of grief, but even younger kids experience grief, maybe a separation. You'd hear stories from parents or patients about how a child is crying a lot or can't sleep, there's change in feeding and sleeping patterns, won't accept food from a different person if there is absence or separation from their parent or caregiver, especially in the first 2 years of life, which we also consider very crucial for the attachment process to set in. Children can experience this as significant separation anxiety, and this could even be seen sometimes as regression to earlier stages of development. As the child grows older, there is an increasing understanding about illness and death. If you're dealing with a child who is 2 to 5 years old and you're talking to them about the illness, the death of a loved one, often the questions you might hear are, did someone die? Will I die too? What about so-and-so? Will this happen to me? Grief can present again as changes in appetite, sleep, behavior. Child could present more irritable, angry. There could be more crying, temper tantrums. Often there could also be regressed behavior, as in the children is going back to a stage of development in terms of routines and developmental milestones that they've already achieved, but they're now regressing back to an earlier stage. Again, this is an indication that the child has a lot of feelings around the loss. Younger children, 2 to 5 years old, also engage in a lot of magical thinking, which is, well, if I do X, Y, and Z, then the situation might change. They might have worries about their own health, their own death, and also have a lot of separation anxiety. In children 2 to 5 years old, how parents and caregivers can help make the understanding of the loss better is by having a clear and consistent routine at home and explaining to children in simple, honest language what the family situation is. For example, if someone is hospitalized due to COVID-19 or is very sick and on a ventilator in the ICU, it helps to break the information down to a child in age-appropriate simple language. And while you're doing that, also remember that children may not experience grief as sadness or changes in behavior on a daily basis. Sometimes there could be grief in spurts, when a child feels happy and normal one day and the other day is very sad and missing the loved one. So it's important to help establish a clear and consistent routine at home, which builds in time for play and fun activities, because that's just the normal thing to do for a child who's in this age range. There could also be a need for a lot of physical and emotional comforting and reassurance and reestablishing of feelings of safety and comfort in the home.
Anuja, do you have how many more slides to go?
Not anymore.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, thank you for reminding me about the time. This slide explains again the chronological acquisition of concepts of death through the ages. So usually there's first the understanding of irreversibility, then personal mortality, then that everybody dies. So death is a universal concept. That non-functionality, as in when life-defining capacities have ended, that is also an indication of death. And causality, as in the realistic understanding of events that might cause death. I'm going to skip through a lot of the information because a lot of the practical aspects are similar to all the ages. The important thing to take home from age 5 to 8-year-old is children can still have magical thinking and engage in self-blame around death, but they start developing more of a permanence around the concept of death. And ages 8 to 12 years old is when there is a more concrete understanding about the abstract idea of death and grief. So to conclude, I'm going to keep this short and wrap up my presentation here, is that during the pandemic, children have had to experience and deal with a lot of feelings around illness and death of a loved one. And it's important, in addition to the routine conversations about changes in routine, co-parenting, families having to work from home, and children having to change their routines to not having school or daycare, to also remember that all these conversations have to be held in the context of age and development of a child, and children could be grieving in ways that are not easy to understand for adults.
Okay. Does it wrap up for now, Tanuja, or you have anything else to share?
No, I think this is a good place to stop.
Okay, thank you so much. And that was a very detailed and very interesting presentation. There are a few questions. We'll try to hold it to the end. And Dr. Vasavada, Tariq Bhai, can you go ahead with your talk for a few minutes, and I'll pitch in at the end.
I'll make it very brief and quick.
Okay, thank you.
And so we can go with that. Okay. Can you see this now?
Yeah.
Okay. So we talk about the benefits of the spirituality and meditation in stressful time. In this time that we don't have much time, I'm going to focus on a few slides that I think are important. I'm going to skip the definition of spirituality, etc. I think basically spirituality is not just the religious observance or prayer or meditation. It also means that you can find higher meaning through nature, music, art, your work, or your secular community activity. And spirituality is different from everyone, and it's not same for two person, not even brothers, sisters. Its meanings are different. And Dr. Jeste had touched some of this topic. And there are few ways that spirituality can help with the stress relief. One is that you feel a sense of purpose. You find meaning in your life, and you focus less on unimportant things. So that's what we do in life. We get caught up a lot of on unimportant things. It makes you connect to the world. The more you feel connected, you feel that there is a kind of a positivity around people that you absorb. Again, Dr. Jeste touched this. It releases control from your hand. So sometimes we say, Bhagwan ke haath mein de do, meaning you leave it in God's hand, and then whatever happens, it happens. And that way we have less anxiety. It expands your support network. It kind of, you meet new people, you expose yourself to different things. Even if you're going on a nature walk with a hiking group or something, you can share your inner feelings at times and kind of build relationship. And spirituality also helps to lead a healthier life. And they can better cope with the stress and experience. So this one article that I found, Harold Koenig's article, it's an amazing article that summarizes so many studies. And there are few places where spirituality comes ahead. Is the most robust finding is during the adversity. And this is the adversity that we are facing. So this is the time where spirituality will help us. It also helps in physical and mental illness, coping with adversity. So whether you're taking care of somebody, you are going through own problems, you are having some physical health, it is a robust finding that during that time, spirituality helps. spirituality has somewhat significant positive association with well-being and happiness. And maybe I'd like to ask Dr. Jeste these questions that not always the religious or spiritual people, like for example, society in Denmark and Norway, they score high on happiness, but they're a little bit low on religion than USA, but still I'm not sure where that correlates. There are also studies showing that there is less depression. Biggest one is suicide, anxiety, and substance abuse. And again, the last line, bullet point here, mortality is less. In Women's Health Initiative studies, the people who followed up regularly in religious participation, there were females, 20% less likely to die in a given year. So again, that's important. I'm going to skip these slides, cultivating, etc. I'm going to come back to the this final sentence on spirituality. Your personal concept of spirituality may change with your age and time and life experiences, but it always forms the basis of your well-being, helps you cope with stressors large and small, and affirms your purpose in life. Next step is meditation, and I'm again going to focus it very quickly. Sorry for the time constraint, we have it. But meditation basically is nothing but heightened attention to mind and your body. So when you pay focused attention to that, it's almost like a self-hypnosis where you hypnotize yourself to the level where you forget about the external experiences. And there are different kinds of meditations, and it differs from culture to culture, people to people. And mindful meditation seems to be the one that is in practice. So along with breathing, mental imaginary, you kind of aware of your surrounding and muscle and body relaxations. Of course, benefits, I'm going to skip on that. So this is the important thing. So there are some mindful meditations techniques that one can practice. So one is a chore meditations, meaning your repetitive chores, like you may be doing your cleaning your house, folding laundry, washing windows, doing some kind of washing your car, are the chores of our life. Watering your plants in the garden is my chore meditation. I like it because sometimes I just detach myself from the world and I'm just there. And take a moment of mindfulness, enjoy what you're doing at that point. Walking meditation, so you can take a walk, linking your breathing with your steps, and there are some techniques to do that. Exercise meditation, so if you're exercising, don't just focus on exercise, focus on every part of your muscle, your body, your feelings, and you can probably kind of enjoy that better if you do it that way. And Tai Chi, for example, and yoga, both are kind of exercise meditations in its own way. Two breath, this is something that I sometimes tell my patients to do this. Take 2 breaths before making a phone call. So if you're going to make a difficult phone call to a family or your boss or something, take a 2 breaths. Answering an email that has something that your emotion is going to come out. And this is good transitions for you to kind of chill yourself. Sound cues, choose a particular sound in your daily life and take 2 breaths every time you hear it. So nowadays at 10:30, we have this announcement from hospital, wear your mask, etc., wash your hands. I kind of take a time for impose myself at that point and think through it, how my day is going. And the last slide is about transition. And a lot of people ask me, I do difficult work with grief, pain, seeing everyday difficult patients. How do you not take it with yourself at home? And it's called transition. Your transitions are important when you move from one setting to another. And it's kind of most of us can do it. Sometimes we can't when we had really bad experience at work. So coming from home to work is very example of transition. You need to have some of your routine, your radios, your other things. You can make some phone calls, but please spend some time with yourself because you should be loving yourself. The person that you spend the most time in your life is you. So you need to learn to love yourself. Like Dr. Jeste said, be kind to yourself. And pick a few transitions in your life, like getting into your car, walking towards your workplace or coming back to your parking place, opening your front door before you enter the house. These are the 5 seconds kind of transitions that you can take. And thank you again.
Yeah, I'll go ahead with a brief presentation myself as well.
Let me get back on the Zoom and undo my share the screen. Stop share. Okay.
Thank you so much, Tariq. A nice presentation. And Okay, are you able to see?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, I'm going to touch some of the same thing that my elder statesman, Dr. Jesse, mentioned, and I'll go not as academic, but more user-friendly way. And my favorite quote, a human being is a part of the whole universe and part limited by time and space, but we experience ourselves and thoughts and feelings as separate from the rest. There's a kind of a delusion of consciousness, Albert Einstein. So like Dr. Jesse mentioned, social isolation is a deadly. It causes a lot of mortality and morbidity, and it has been proven over many studies. Chronic socialization increases the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis activation. And there's a growing body of literature recognizing the positive effects of exercise. So right now we're all stuck at home. What can we do to beat some of these blues? Exercise is one thing we can all do, and there's a significant data there to promote exercise, one of the coping mechanisms. Like they say, a sedentary lifestyle is as deadly as smoking cigarettes. Now they say sitting is the new smoking and the chair is the new cigarette. So if we sit long enough, you'll die. So we got to get up and keep moving. And there are physiological, psychological, and immunological responses to exercise that help our body's healing. I'll show you a graphic that kind of shows it. The exercise affects your psychological well-being by self-efficacy and distraction. Immunologically, it improves your cytokines and vagal tone. Physiologically, improves your endorphin levels, HPA access, etc. I'm rushing kind of to catch up with the time. Again, physical activity has multiple health benefits, including cardiovascular as well as mental health. Even cognitively, it improves. Meta-analysis showed there's a better retention and focus and high school performance. And again, we're all stuck at home with each other, spouses. How do we improve our communication? It's very important that we relate better with our spouses now. The studies have shown that we're spending 20 minutes a week talking to each other, and it's not enough. Be intentional about spending enough time together. At least allocate 20 to 30 minutes a day catching up with each other. Turn off the technology during that time. Use more I statement and less you statement. This is, people don't have to defend themselves when you use I statements. For example, I would like to acknowledge, I wish you could acknowledge more often how much I work at home and take care of your children than saying that you don't do anything or something like that. So how do we improve communication or relationship? Express negative feelings constructively. There will be times you'll be frustrated, disappointed, you want to express those feelings, but you do it in a way, again, making I statements rather than you statement that will be more receptive. Be very specific, don't give generalization. You do it all the time with a generalization. Just be specific what you're upset about, what you have some negative feelings about. So that kind of helps your communication. Again, avoid mind reading. You expect other people to know sometimes what you're thinking, and you also try to read other people's mind. It all causes a lot of miscommunication. And listen without being defensive. I think we all have a tendency to be defensive. As soon as somebody either says something or criticizes, we tend to jump in to defend ourselves. Just let them speak out, and then you don't have to defend. Let them express their feelings. And every time, remember, you have to express positive feelings. We tend to take it for granted. Your wife or your spouse cooks a delicious meal. We take it for granted, we enjoy it, and we don't say a word. Give positive appreciation, affection, respect, admiration, approval, warmth to your spouse during daily conversation. For every criticism you're going to make at least 5 positive compliments before you do that. Then they'll be more ready to receive it. So listen to understand, ask questions, but deeper questions, avoid interruptions, don't withhold judgment, don't be distracted because you're already getting some phone call or a message, you're distracted. Slow down, just be silent, but give some nonverbal cues. This is the best way to communicate. So we talked about exercise and relationships. Again, Dr. Jasti mentioned gratitude. Gratitude is not only the greatest virtue, it's the parent of all virtues. This was told by Cicero in 106 BC. So it's not a new concept, but we are rediscovering with all new studies. So a high number of studies showed high level of trait gratitude are associated with increased life satisfaction, vitality, happiness. And there are cognitive framework and a psychosocial framework to describe what gratitude does. Here is a cognitive framework. A positive, when you express a feeling of gratitude, you are experiencing a positive interpretational bias, and that generates positive neuronal changes and physiological changes. That gives you a positive sense of well-being. And the psychosocial framework is you compliment somebody who was great, you're a benefactor, that increases your social network, that increases the relationship, and that actually makes you also a benefactor in the future. So the gratitude is a virtuous cycle. So spirituality also, like Dr. Tarak Vaswada mentioned, is a coping behavior. Spirituality involves social support, guidelines for healthy living, relating with others, providing meaning, especially during the times of trial. Again, religiosity is different from spirituality. Spirituality promotes gratitude. Forgiving is also a very important part of spirituality. Altruism and well-being. These are all, again, a virtuous cycle. And emotional intelligence, this is again Dr. Jasti mentioned. Coleman became very famous talking about emotional intelligence, but before that, this concept was talked about by many others, including Peter Solvay, who is now the president of Yale University. He was the dean before, now he's the president. He's the one first coined emotional intelligence as a term. But even before him, there were other people who talked about as social intelligence, and Wechsler, in Wechsler's scale, there is items that are not entirely intellectual intelligence, but social intelligence, emotional intelligence related topics. So these concepts were there, but this caught on with Peter Solvay and Daniel Goleman's writings. So emotional intelligence is accurate perception of your own emotions, and also managing your own emotions and recognizing the emotions in others and negotiating a relationship with others, so you all both are working on the same goal. This is very good for team players, especially in work situation or even in a family situation. How you regulate your own emotion, how you communicate your own emotion. And one way to regulate your own emotion is to name it, to tame it. You first have to identify your emotions, give a name to your emotions, and feel what your emotions are telling you. And then try to read other people's emotions and see where they're coming from and how you can relate with them and communicate with them and negotiate a solution if there is a problem. Again, optimism is another trait that is, again, very important. Martin Seligman made a career of defining optimism, how we react to problems, and how two people can be different. For example, there are two students who receive as poor grades, an optimistic student versus a pessimistic student. First student thinks I'm such a failure. I always do poorly in this subject. I can't do anything right. The second student will say, this test is difficult. I can do better in another class. I tend to do well in other. So bottom line is, the first student who's a kind of pessimist sees himself in a global way, not in a specific way, that he's a failure. He's internalizing the failure. And also he's generalizing it. He says, I'm always doing poorly. And then he's also saying, futuristically, he cannot do anything right. So it's pervasive, it's personalizing, it's permanent. He's making all those statements. Whereas the second student, he says it's a difficult test. He's externalizing, he's not personalizing it. And he says, okay, I didn't do so well in this class, but I'll do in another class. That means he's taking a positive view of things that he can do better in other classes. So he's not globalizing it. Specifically, he says, I'm not good in this class, maybe I'll do better in the future class. So he's not taking it personally, he's not making it a permanent thing, he's not taking it as a unchangeable thing. So that is the difference between optimistic versus pessimistic in a kind of a nutshell. There's much more to it, but that's a kind of nutshell. And mindfulness, again, Dr. Vaswada mentioned, these are the 7 key elements of mindfulness. John Kabat-Zinn from University of Massachusetts started studying in 1990. Now there are so many studies. It started with like 1,000 studies at that time. Now there are 100,000 studies done. Non-judgmental attitude, being patient with your own self. Always look at it with the beginner's mind. Have a sense of awe. Dr. Jasti mentioned about savoring. Savor the moments. Trust in yourself. And sometimes you don't have to prove yourself to anybody. Acceptance is very important. Letting go is also important. These are all elements of mindfulness. And again, self-compassion is very important, and otherwise it will take a toll on you. And we're all living busy lives, especially with the media and all that. And this, I will skip the rest of it here. Again, diet. Now we talked about exercise, we talked about relationships, we talked about spirituality and meditate and mindfulness. And diet is also very important for your well-being. There are some studies, reduction in meat consumption improves your mood. And also a low-fat diet is better than low-calorie diet for mood and cognition. So one cannot help but be in awe when one contemplates the mysteries of the eternity and of life and marvelous structure of reality. I have a lot of other slides, but I'll skip here and I'll stop here and we'll get back to any question and answers here. Let me see. How do I get out of here? Okay, all right. So that's about our topics here. And as far as media is concerned, there are some questions about media. We have to wrap it in 1 minute. Anybody wants to make any parting comments, final remarks before we leave? Because the next panel is already here. Dr. Jesse?
No, I think the question about media was, I think, probably whether to use them. And media are plus and a minus, obviously. The media can be useful for older people now because they don't have social connection. At the same time, when they are not friendly, they can actually produce more stress.
Actually, there is a study that the mobile phone ownership and smartphone ownership has kind of parallel with the decrease in happiness and stress and self-esteem. Tanuja, you have any parting comments? We can't hear you. You had to unmute yourself.
Yeah, so just that, this is not the time to count the number of hours your child is on social media or make that prescription. Everybody's having to be more flexible, and using media to actually stay in touch with family members has been very helpful, especially older family members who they can't personally meet.
I have a feeling, I think we regulate interstate highway, but not the information highway is free flowing. Everybody gets on it, from a child to adolescents to oldest people. It's crazy out there. Be careful. Next, Dr. Vaswada, any comments?
Well, I just want to say thank you for API to letting us participate, Dr. Reddy and Dr. Seema Arora. To organizing this amazing convention. This is trying time. We have time to try out new things. So like Tanuja said, it's something that we can create our own way of living in a way. I think the pandemic is not going to go away for next year or so at least. So we have to come up with some creative ways to enjoy our life and savor this moment, because sometimes difficulty teaches us how to learn further in our life. So
all right. Again, I want to thank API for allowing us to present our information here. And again, Dr. Reddy and Dr. Seema Arora, the BOT and the president, thank you. And all the members and panelists and participants, thank you for being here and asking such a thoughtful questions. So sorry we could not answer all the questions because of the shortness of time and lack of time, because the next presentation is starting soon. Thank you again and have a good night and be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jasti and Tanuja.